Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm Kim Wardle, Global Commercial Director for TDA, the Tech Product and Design Talent Agency. And although placing top talent is our day job, we also run these events to give back to our communities. So thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Cristina Dolan, who is our speaker for today's event, The Future of Tech, Understanding the Confluence of Technologies and Regulations in a Sustainable World. And for those of you that don't know Cristina, her talent is endless. She's an engineer, a computer scientist with a successful track record as a technology executive at companies such as RSA, IBM, Oracle, Disney, and Hearst, leading global channel alliances, technology, and sales. She's also an entrepreneur who's focused on cybersecurity, health tech, and fintech. Her experiences include being a CEO of a VC-backed AI company spun out of MIT and co-founder of a telecoms company that had a very successful IPO and exit. In addition, she's also co-authored books and articles on ESG, data, AI, cybersecurity, and Industry 5.0. She's received numerous honors and awards. Cristina serves on the board of 3 public companies and understands the roles of data and technology in a growing regulatory landscape. So I can safely say you're in good hands today. Just a few points before I hand over to Cristina. As you can see, I am recording today's session, and we'll also be sharing the recording on the TDA website and on our social media pages. So please like and share. I'll also send it over to you guys directly. Cristina will now spend about 40 minutes sharing her insights, and this will be followed by about 20 minutes of Q&As. So please have your questions ready and raise your hand when the time comes. Can I please ask that you do keep your mics on mute just in time, until you're ready to ask your question. But now, without further ado, over to Cristina.
Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. And let me just share my presentation. Can everybody see that?
You can.
Wonderful. Hey, Dan, how are you? And Mike Reed, I haven't seen you in a while. So it's great to see so many wonderful faces. And of course, Kimberly and TDA, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present. This is obviously one of my favorite topics. I actually think that this industrial revolution that we're facing right now is probably one of the most exciting that we've ever seen of all these industrial revolutions. And it's because of the confluence of all these interesting technologies, AI, cyber, data. But what's interesting is that in the context of all of this opportunity, there's also sustainability issues with respect to will companies survive, right? And that's about innovation. And I know that we talk a lot about sustainability from an ESG perspective, but as we saw during the pandemic, over the course of the past 120 some odd years, we have become very dependent on organizations for everything from infrastructure to healthcare to jobs, everything around us. And so the vulnerability that exists when companies don't innovate or when there are cybersecurity risks, and of course, with all the growth in data that's enabling the AI and all this innovation, there is a rising risk landscape. So with that, I'm going to start my presentation, and hopefully if you have any questions, you'll put those in the chat so we can chat about those later. So just to put this in context, I'm going to start off with sustainability because I did write a book on ESG, and unfortunately, everybody thinks of it as just being carbon. But I like to think about it from the perspective of the survivability of companies because, as I said, we're so dependent on them. So let me start there. And first of all, ESG has many lenses, and that's one of the unfortunate things about it is that it means a lot of different things to different people. But the 2 lenses that I'm going to focus on right now are, company self-reporting and investor frameworks, because those are the 2 frameworks that are the 2 lenses that are sort of applicable to whether or not companies survive, which I think is really important these days. So in that context, it's important to understand that ESG and sustainability are risk metrics. And unfortunately, unlike bond risk metrics, which are more standardized, there's a lot of variation in this risk. But I think it's just important to note that it is a risk metric. And investors have a variety of different data sets and ways of analyzing this risk. And then companies have a variety of different ways by which they report this risk. And so it can be a little bit confusing, but at the end, it's a risk around will companies survive? And as we talk about all of these sort of new innovations that are becoming available that organizations can utilize, it's really important to understand that being able to be adaptable and be able to embrace these technologies and understand how to use them in an organization becomes really important. So I'm going to sort of lean in a little bit more into the, like how investors look at ESG and sustainability. And I'm not talking about the carbon side. I'm really talking about, how they look at it from an investment in an organization. And so when there are funds or organizations that invest and they talk about their investment philosophy, there are a variety of different ways of describing that. And so you've always had this sort of negative screening that's been used, like for religious groups, for years. The Sharia law. Some religions will not invest in healthcare because of certain things that are not in line with their values, for example. And then you have single focus groups, for example, or single focus methodologies that have to do with, for example, carbon, or whether or not there are enough women at the senior level of the organization. But those singular focus philosophies don't necessarily they're not necessarily going to tell you whether or not the company is going to survive. That's really about their philosophy. And so best in class, which is used by most investors, really means the organizations that are leading in their particular industry, right? And so those are the ones that are going to survive. So from a sustainability perspective of a company, from that lens, will the company survive? There are a lot of organizations from ESG perspective that focus on that. And the argument by the investors is that by investing in these organizations that have a big influence on society, they have the ability to make sure that they maintain certain values. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. So why does sustainability matter? I mean, we saw this during the pandemic, right? When you couldn't get things like toilet paper or, car engines or a bike. And so companies matter, and they're a part of every part of our life. So when organizations fail, it's not just the employees and investors, because you have to think about all these organizations being in these connected ecosystems, right? So there is an impact on the entire ecosystem, and it has to do with partners and customers and suppliers. And more importantly, when these sort of smaller companies that are doing business with these larger companies are part of the supply chain, when there's these sort of failures that take place, it affects the communities where these people live. So, for example, the tax base that pays for institutions like education, maybe healthcare. It'll also affect all the local services, from food to people that provide services for a variety of different things that we depend upon. So companies have become a very big part of our lives, and not just in employment, but because we live in a connected ecosystem. And so when companies fail, they sort of have a ripple effect on the rest of the community. So it's important to understand that sustainability is really important, and innovation is a very big part of that. So I'm going to put this in a little bit of a different context. So I took a couple of companies that have a lot of subscribers and sort of mapped them out on the list there last week, and tried to compare them to the number of citizens in certain countries. And if you look at that list, some of the largest, countries with the largest number of citizens, you realize that companies like Apple and Spotify, Netflix, and Prime Video have more active subscribers that are engaging with their brand than there are citizens in each country. And I bet you that some of the citizens in some of those countries probably could not list, some of the regulations or laws that are being considered, or some of the important aspects of their country, but yet they could tell you what the top 10 shows are that are available on Netflix or one of these other streaming services. So it's important to understand the impact. And then from an ecosystem of partners, these large companies have a very big effect on the ecosystem of organizations that they work with. And then when you look at it from a market cap perspective, these companies have market caps that are equivalent to GDP of some countries. And so that in itself gives you some insights as to the influence that these companies had. So once again, They're part of ecosystems that affect a lot of other organizations. And what's interesting is if you look at the S&P companies from, I would say, 1960s, the average tenure of some of the big companies was about 60 years. And today, the majority of companies, I would say, have maybe 15, 20 years on the S&P. And so it's interesting to see that the longevity, and it could be because of acquisitions or other means, but understanding how to embrace innovation is really important. So another reason why ESG and sustainability are important to companies, which is sort of subtle, but it's because if companies aren't sustainable and from an ESG perspective are not perceived to be doing the right thing, they will be suffocated by the fact that they won't get revenue from customers and they won't get capital. And you need both of those things to be able to grow, right? So, and then you take it down a level, and you saw this with a number of the big tech companies where people disagreed with the philosophy of the organization and the talent left, right? And so your ability to build the product, support the product, be able to engage with other organizations is all dependent upon that your sustainability. Are you going to be in business? Because people don't want to buy products from a company that's failing, right? And also they want to make sure that they're partnering with organizations that are doing the right thing. So now I'm going to take this from a little bit of a different perspective, because this is sort of one of the reasons why I'm focusing on innovation today, is that when you have these massive, the industrial revolutions, of which we've had a number of them, typically you have a number of different technologies that are available, and the confluence and use of those technologies to solve interesting problems or create new opportunities tends to create a lot of change. And if you read Jeremy Rifkin's book, The Third Industrial Revolution, he is a professor at Wharton. When he talks about the industrial revolutions, he always says that you have the transformation of economic value in terms of how it's powered, communicated, and moved has new opportunities, which creates a lot of changes, both socially as well as economically. And in this fourth industrial revolution, I would actually argue that there are many more innovations that are becoming available that are going to be cross-pollinating and solving a lot of very interesting problems. But you have to keep in mind that sustainability requires understanding what these technologies can offer, embracing them, and making sure that organizations continue to innovate. So every one of these industrial revolutions has caused a lot of change. So in the early days, people moved off farms, and I think something like 90-something% of people lived on farms before the first industrial revolution. And of course, I think only a single-digit number of people live on farms today, right? So, there was a big change in what people did for a living, how they worked with organizations. And then there was a lot of work that was done by companies that realized that humans were a very important part of their companies. And so there was a lot of social change. There was a lot of change that happened. Think about cars. People started living differently. And then, of course, when technology became available, you look at the sharing economy, IoT, data networks. So there's a lot of change, both socially as well as opportunistically, right? So there are negative aspects to this, like carbon, and we hear a lot about that. And I would actually say that, having written a book on ESG, I often get upset that carbon is the only thing anybody talks about in terms of these negative side effects of these industrial revolutions. But in reality, the biggest risk, and it's not because I've worked in cyber for a number of years in a variety of different roles that I like to talk about cyber, but it is the most immediate financially material risk that exists today. And so I actually co-authored an article for the World Economic Forum, and it was timely because it was just at the time the war in Ukraine broke out, and there was a lot of threats against our financial networks. But in reality, cyber, because of our dependency on data, the growth of data, is a big threat, and it's being weaponized by nation states. And so the FBI stated that 8% of the North Korean GDP comes from this type of what I'd say criminal activity, and it's growing at 40%. So if you were an investor, not that you would want to invest in criminal activities, you would see that with a 40% growth rate, it's going to be hard to get these nation states to stop. But the cost of these security breaches is increasing as our use of data continues to grow. And unfortunately, the detection and prosecution of the criminals has not been as high as we would like it to be. And so, this causes, some significant risks, but it is probably one of the most, one of the biggest threats that organizations in this new industrial revolution that we're facing have to deal with. And part of the reason is because cyber is dependent on, so cybersecurity is the confidentiality, the integrity and availability of data, right? And so with the growth of data, you would imagine that with all this valuable data, the cyber risk will continue to grow. In addition to that, you have to think about the complex networks, IoT devices. Think about hospitals, and they talk about how 60% of life support IoT devices can be possibly hacked by cyber criminals. So you start to realize that the vulnerability is increasing as we begin to use more and more of these devices and data. Of course, we have to mention that this year is a record year in terms of the number of elections that are taking place. I think there's never been a point in time where so many people on Earth have been voting. I think over 50% of the population is supposedly voting in their countries. 64 countries have scheduled elections. And so there's a lot of talk. When I was at Davos, this was one of the top topics that people were talking about, was the fear of the misinformation and trust that would arise from the creation of all this data. So when I talk about this next industrial revolution being, I think, even more powerful than the ones we've seen in the past, is because there are so many different technologies that are, emerging. And Kathy Wood has a really great TED Talk. I know she's somewhat controversial, but if you look at her TED Talk, and she talks about, some of these technologies from, blockchains to multinomics sequencing, this is in the healthcare space, artificial intelligence, robotics, energy storage, which, the robotics and AI also include self-driving cars and trucks. I mean, one of the areas that I've worked in as sort of an interim CEO was in the area of cyber insurance for self-driving trucking. And one of the things that's interesting about that is that there's about 70,000 open recs in the United States for long haul trucking. And unfortunately, it's a very tough job. So this is an area in which, through innovation, the ability to have these long haul vehicles assisted with AI to make it a much safer form of transportation, but also assist with helping with this area where there's a talent shortage. And I understand there's also a talent shortage in Europe as well. So I think that there's a great opportunity to be able to solve a lot of interesting problems that are out there through the use of all of these various technologies. And at the center, of course, data is driving a lot of this innovation. And because of the fact that over the course of the last 20 years, with the use of the internet, there is so much data and connectivity that's out there. The ability to innovate and utilize these technologies to solve new and interesting problems, to create new opportunities, becomes even greater. It does increase our risk, but it also allows us to solve some interesting problems. So journey of a patients in value-based healthcare is something that one of the companies I co-founded at Addon has been focused on, and it's won some awards recently. So in healthcare, this is one of these areas where I talk about that you have a lot of problems, and particularly like in Italy and in Spain. In 5 years, there will be 50% less doctors in Italy because of the number of doctors that are retiring, and there haven't been enough, people that have entered in that career. And so you have these aging populations that need more care. And then you have unfortunately, you have a healthcare system where you have less trained people to be able to provide those services. So being able to use data and information in order to be able to manage that, those processes, and really understand where the value is created and where the waste is, and trying to find ways to improve the delivery of healthcare becomes even more important. Of course, we've all heard this example as one of the oldest ones around, but when you think about blockchain one of the areas that people talk about is in supply chains, because supply chains are made up of a lot of individual uh, siloed entities that are involved all along from the farm where a pear might be picked, or from a factory, or some originating source. And then there's various transportation mechanisms, and they have their own siloed systems and warehouses. And so being able to figure out where things originated from, and were they are they safe? There obviously have been some issues with food safety, in which they had to identify where the supplier was that provided the fruit or vegetable that created some issues. And so obviously these are problems that are being addressed with technology. And of course, when you look at our food supply and our there's a lot of vulnerability there, because our supply systems have a lot of centralized components that could very easily be a cyber target as well. So back to innovation, innovation creates opportunities. And one example I always love to talk about, because I live in Manhattan, and so in the late 1800s, there were tons of horses. And so as a result of that, you had the great manure crisis with 100,000, 150,000 at peak horses. So if you're ever here in the Upper East Side or Upper West Side of Manhattan, you'll see these great staircases that lead up to the front door of these beautiful townhouses. And part of the reason is because during the era when it was built, you had this great manure crisis. And so people didn't necessarily want to live on the first floor too close to the manure. But of course, when Henry Ford created the ability to generate cars and economically, this changed society. I mean, people didn't have to live and work nearby. It created a lot of aspects of people's social lives, and this, of course, occurred during one of our big industrial revolutions. But it created a lot of opportunity and change, and of course, the the great manure crisis, of course, ended, and nobody ever talks about it again. But you do still see those grand staircases in Manhattan. This is one of my favorites, because this is a wonderful example. So in the 1950s, you had a lot of new kind of devices that were available for the home that will eliminate a lot of the manual work that women would do. And so you went from only 5% of married women being part of the workforce in the early 1900s to about 51% of women participating in the workforce. And of course, from economic perspective, there was great prosperity. A lot of people were participating in the economy. There was a lot of growth. And so this was a positive thing. And so I do believe that while there's been a lot of fear about this next industrial revolution and how the technologies are going to cannibalize a lot of jobs and companies, I do think that there's opportunities if you embrace the technology and figure out how to problem solve using that technology. And of course, another innovation that created opportunity was smartphones. And obviously, there's been a lot of apps that have been created, and it completely changed the way we communicate. But on the flip side of this, it's important to note that when organizations don't embrace innovation, they don't survive. And embracing innovation can be challenging. I'm currently teaching a course at Columbia University on it's a capstone class, and we use design thinking to the students work on real projects with organizations where we solve complex problems. And your ability to sort of understand what the problem is, what the customer needs, and iterate and come up with solutions that make sense, that utilize these technologies, is in and of itself a difficult challenge. So it's important to note that a lot of the innovation that we're talking about that is part of this industrial revolution is driven by data. And of course, the past 20 years with the internet and all the innovation that's happened, there's been a lot of growth in that space. And there's a lot of confusion. So artificial intelligence has been around for a long time. I was CEO of a MIT spinout that did machine learning, computational linguistics, a lot of Chomsky's students. And that was about 20 years ago. And so as a result of that, that wasn't really part of like today's sort of generative AI era. But I think it's important to note that there's a difference between these various types of artificial intelligence. And what's interesting is that they all have different capabilities, but I don't think average person understands, the sort of journey of artificial intelligence. I mean, I think we've seen them all in movies, and I think people saw the movie about Alan Turing that came out a couple of years ago. But as you can see, it's had a long journey, and it wasn't until the last 20 years where you had AlphaGo with DeepMind and the 2017 paper Attention All You Need that the world started to change. In 2020, you had ChatGPT-3 with APIs that were being used by people that were building out the first applications using generative AI, and then you had ChatGPT that came out, which of course was consumers were using that, and of course everybody is familiar with this type of generative AI. But for those of us who've been in the space for a while, you realize it's had a boom bust cycle with a variety of different types of AI that have caused a lot of excitement. And so just to give you a quick synopsis here, I mean, when you look at the different types of AI and different types of machine learning, there's so many different characteristics. So it's important to appreciate that where we are today in generative AI is not the only type of artificial intelligence that can create value as we begin to innovate using these technologies and the availability of data. So here are just some of the applications that were around before generative AI. I mean, so silly things like, toll bridge, being able to use the ability to read license plates for security. There have been things in the expert systems space, energy management, robotics, OCR, simple OCR, where you scan a document and it's able to convert that into text, virtual assistant. So there's been a lot of technology, medical imaging. There's just been a lot of artificial intelligence prior to the last few years. And this is a CB Insights chart that I like to show because it shows you all the categories of companies that were in the AI space prior to all of this excitement, doing a variety of different things. That were slightly different from what we think of today in terms of artificial intelligence. Now, what's interesting is, with all of the hype, when people talk about artificial intelligence, they try to talk about how it's going to change the world, doom and gloom, and it's basically going to take away sort of the enjoyment of things that people like to do. And when you look at artificial intelligence in chess, I mean, obviously, I was lucky enough to actually attend one of the Garry Kasparov games that IBM hosted, and there was a lot of excitement when that took place. But it didn't make chess less interesting. As a matter of fact, it's still extremely popular. But what's interesting is that now the moves that are being used by these grandmasters are much more diverse, and they've incorporated a lot of learnings that they've learned from artificial intelligence. What's also interesting was a statistic about how in the European Online Chess Championship in May of 2020, which was during the sort of the pandemic, approximately 2% of the players were disqualified for using some sort of computing engines. But still, I just want to point out that just because artificial intelligence is good at certain things doesn't mean that that it completely will remove the opportunity to be able to do things in these creative spaces that AI is currently being used for. So I think it's really important. If you haven't read this paper, I highly suggest that you go read it. It's called Attention is All You Need. It was a bunch of people from Google. They're not there. They've gone on to start all these incredible AI companies. But that was kind of a turning point because it was this attention mechanism that gave birth to this sort of generative trend that we're in right now. So I just want to, just so that people can appreciate a little bit more about sort of what this generative capability offers. In the traditional sort of machine learning space before this era, and in the company that I was CEO of, when you were trying to train these these systems using sort of machine learning, there was a human element to be able to train these systems. And so that was a tremendous amount of work, and it cost a lot of money to be able to train those systems to be able to do these specific tasks. And today with deep learning, there is a sort of learning mechanism that is very important. And this just gives you a little bit more depth on that. So, in the era on the left, the machine learning era, for all these different machine learning models, you needed a variety of different use cases. For all these different use cases, you needed to have labeled data for each of them. And it was a tremendous amount of work in order to make that work, right? And today, because of the fact that you can utilize these technologies, you can have unlabeled data. And if you look at the amount of unstructured data that's out there, if you want to be able to harness that knowledge and be able to incorporate that and learn from it, the ability to be able to use these technologies to be able to do things like text generation, classification, information extraction becomes really important. So economically, it's a lot easier and faster to be able to extract that information. And so for those that want to sort of understand a little bit, and I'm oversimplifying this, but I took this from one of the existing white papers, is that generative AI uses probability. And so, it will start with like once upon, and then, the LLM helps it find, and then helps it find time. And so this sort of uses a probabilistic engine to figure out what that next word could be, which is actually challenging because a lot of times the following words are possibly in the long tail of the usage, vocabulary usage, and not necessarily in the most actively used words. So it's not an easy puzzle. And just to give you a little bit more visibility into this, I mean, this is a three-dimensional model just to show you sort of how these vectors that represent these words are sort of placed in this multi-dimensional space. Of course, it's just three-dimensional because I'm just trying to show you the example. And so these models use a type of Euclidean distance between vectors or cosine similarity in order to determine which of those vectors seems most similar. And so it takes a lot of complex math to figure out what those relationships are. And so just as an example, if you go to OpenAI platform and you type in a sentence, it'll tell you how many tokens and characters and token IDs, and it just gives you a sense of how complex the representation is. And also, one of the other important components is that, and from a cybersecurity perspective, when artificial intelligence ingests content and converts it into these models, it then gets represented into sort of a numeric vector space, which makes it very difficult to pull that data out. So when AI consumes sensitive information, mathematically gets locked in, it's very difficult to pull it out. It's like impossible to pull it out because it's hard to identify where in that system it lives. The other thing I want to point out is that not all generative AI is the same. And so there's always a lot of concern with respect to the use of AI and having it swallow up that information, which is something I just talked about, right? But not all AI is in the public domain in an open AI general purpose system. You can have small LLMs and or you can have an environment that's private, and you can download your own trained LLM, and you can use a variety of different techniques. So one of the areas that's kind of interesting is that people look at ChatGPT as a mechanism for interacting with complex traditional systems, where these traditional systems aren't necessarily part of a trained AI environment, for lack of trying to make this somewhat simplistic, but being able to use a AI interface to be able to ask questions in English or a particular language, and having those converted into a query that finds that across a variety of complex systems in order to be able to pull up information also creates value. So it can be configured in private, public. It could be just used as a query language. Not all generative AI is the same. So when you think about this as a palette on, for innovation, you have to think about sort of what is it that you're trying to accomplish before you assume that you have to build out your own LLM and spend, hundreds of billions of dollars or, trying to build these types of systems. And so there are a lot of examples out there. There are a lot of companies that are building AI enhanced customer services. You just have a list there. Obviously, Salesforce has been doing the Einstein bots for a significant amount of time. And what's interesting is in the education space, where I think that some of these AI technologies can be very helpful because you can just ask questions about how something works, right? So I am a big fan of Duolingo, and so they have incorporated a form of AI to help its learners be more effective at understanding, how in their learning journey, right? And Khan Academy has also created an AI-powered virtual assistant. So once again, there are many different versions of even the generative AI, and it can be used to do a number of different things. When I was in Davos, I remember the CEO of, I think it was IKEA, was talking about how they were using, I think it was Copilot, Microsoft's Copilot, as a mechanism to provide information to anybody who was speaking to a customer in order to increase sales of kitchen renovations, which I guess is the most profitable part of their business. And they had like double-digit improvement over the course of a quarter from using this interactive capability to be able to provide just-in-time information to anybody who was talking to a customer. So once again, we have to think about this from problem solving. What is your goal? What are you trying to do? And really think about these technologies and other technologies as tools to be able to solve interesting problems. And the AI ecosystem has so many different components. And if you think about it, there is a shortage of talent across the board, from hyperscalers to chip providers. I mean, if you think about in Taiwan, the creation of these chips and the skill sets that are required there, I mean, incredible talent that's required to build these next generation chips. I would actually argue that in Arizona, where we have the CHIP Act, we're probably not even going to create as sophisticated a set of chips as what you've seen in Taiwan. And then you think about the devices that are used to be able to etch on those chips. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem around that. There are transformers, there are data providers, there are small language models, private large language models. There are AI agent service providers. There are so many different components to this AI ecosystem. And I would actually argue that the talent isn't 100% there yet. So I'm somewhat sensitive because people always say that technology takes jobs away. And, of course, if you look at the chart on the left, agriculture has decreased over the course of time, but I would say people have a better quality of life. And on the right is a chart that, predicts all the jobs that will be lost from AI. But I actually would say that you have to take into consideration the fact that there are a lot of other, opportunities for talent. So the big trick here is for organizations to understand how to innovate. And it's the organizations that understand how to problem solve, how to, ideate, they understand the design thinking, how to embrace these technologies and figure out how to solve interesting problems are probably going to continue to grow. And then the ones that don't, and the individuals that won't, will struggle because the jobs will change. And so I will quickly show this. I mean, I'm sure that everybody's familiar with all the types of jobs that have evolved with the fourth industrial revolution. That's, computing and internet, e-commerce, digital advertising. And the Federal Reserve just put out a statistic that 92% of jobs in all industries require some digital skills. So there has been a number of jobs that have been created that didn't even exist before. And then, of course, over the course of the last 10, 20 years, obviously there have been a lot of different types of opportunities that have been created through all the various technologies that are evolving, right? And so, as I said in the beginning, Goldman Sachs estimates that the use of all of these different technologies will actually drive 7 trillion increase in global GDP. And as I said before, some folks are saying it could add 7 to 10% of growth to the global GDP. And so when you think about AI for sustainability, there's so many different examples. I won't go through all of them, but just keep in mind that AI is driven by information, and over the next 5 years, 90% of the data will be unstructured. So you will need the tools to be able to extract value from them. And obviously, data is growing exponentially. So with the growth of data, of course, there are regulations, and there's tons of regulations. I'm sure you've heard of it. Having worked in the institutional financial trading space, I love to show this chart because these are all the various regulations. And if you look down into all the details, this is an E&Y chart that's a couple of years old. But all these regulations, I mean, there's data. This is all data driven, right? So being able to be regulatory in compliance, it requires data. It's completely data driven, right? And so we've seen a growing number of data protection laws that have been coming out. I mean, obviously, there was one that just came out, announced in, I think it was Utah. We have GDPR, was one of the oldest, and Europe is really good at creating regulations. But now we're starting to see cybersecurity and risk management becoming a bigger part of the regulatory landscape, and there's more responsibility in terms of when there's a breach and disclosing. So I would say that regulatory compliance is going to drive the requirement for understanding the data and understanding the risk and within your organizations. And once again, I always like to talk about the AI risks associated with cybersecurity, because if you think about it, AI is about you're pulling data out of an organization, and a lot of times data isn't well tagged as being confidential or having personally identifiable information or whatever the characteristics are. And so if Gen AI can go through your email or through a variety of different systems in your organization, pull up data, create a summary, which it generates, right? And then you can, boom, send it out. There's a bunch of little opportunities in which you can have, these regulatory issues with respect to utilizing confidential regulated information and sending it to the wrong people. And so it requires an additional level of governance to understand that and be able to protect against that. And so governance, when we think about ESG, in my mind, is even more important than just the E or the S, because without governance, you can't even have the KPIs or the ability to manage these other two. So kind of going back to ESG, which I'll go through really quickly, I think in some ways it's been hijacked and people think it's just about carbon. There are a variety of organizations. I mean, SASB is known as the Sustainability of Organizations with its materiality map. It's just recently merged. But there's a ton of organizations, right? And there's all these different reporting mechanisms, and companies will choose a variety of them when they report. So that creates some level of confusion. The most popular ones, of course, everybody talks about the UN sustainability goals. That's about, will the earth survive, right? SASB is about, will an organization survive, right? It's the risk of the world onto an organization. And there's materiality map, which you can barely see because it's on the left side of that chart. But they have a materiality map that is specific to certain industries. And then GRI is an organization's impact on the world. So they all have different approaches, different lenses, and it just adds to a level of confusion. They all use a variety of different data types. They source them from different places. So some people use, for example, BlackRock has said on one of the conferences that they use satellite data for water tables, where somebody might use 3-year-old FEMA data. But they'll also get things like the number of product lawsuits and other data points to determine how well a company's managed and understand the governance in an organization. So just to sum up, ESG has so many different frameworks and standards, and it's not like bond ratings. It has a variety of different lenses and different ways it's aggregated and different ways it's used with different timelines, and so it's difficult to understand what it actually means. But in reality, it's governance, and without technology, data, and a corporate culture, one which embraces innovation, it becomes really, really difficult to manage ESG as a whole. And so to summarize, we live in a really exciting, very exciting era. And I think that there's going to be a lot of opportunities to solve some very interesting problems through the use of this confluence of all these different technologies. But it introduces a requirement for fast learning, acquiring skills, and organizations really do have to learn how to innovate and how to utilize like design thinking and all these methodologies to be able to incorporate these technologies in their organizations in order to survive. I mean, one of the statistics I pointed out in the beginning is that in the 1960s, the tenure of an S&P company was about 60 years on the S&P. And then today it's, 15, 20 years. And that has a lot to do with sort of the change of, the rapidly changing landscape. A lot of these companies get acquired, but innovation is basically one of the most important aspects of ESG today. And so to embrace these technologies, I think that's what is most important. And so it's Q&A time. So Kimberly, should we, I'll stop sharing my deck.
Yeah, that was wonderful. We really are in a world of opportunity, but some very scary insights there. That was incredible. Thank you, Christina. I'm sure there's lots and lots of questions from the audience now. So, would the first person like to put up their hand?
Oh, so Dan has a question there. So he
Oh,
said,
here we go.
Dan, hey, Dan, how are you?
Hey,
So your
Chris.
question, so what skill sets, of course, you're a recruiter and a career coach. So of course, you're going to ask the question about the skill sets that are most valuable in this next industrial revolution. And so I would actually say, I would say the innovation is probably the most important skill set. And I know that you can drill down and learn all these technologies, but what's kind of interesting is that in order to be able to figure out, okay, where in my organization can I utilize these technologies? You have to really be able to use design thinking and problem solving, and then be able to iterate and figure out who your customer is. And that's like that that's a people problem solving skill set, which obviously requires a lot of critical thinking. I think about the technologies sort of as like a big paint palette or a Lego set, right? And once you understand what it is that you're trying to achieve or solve, and then work through the organization to be able to implement the required processes in order to be able to explore and test and turn these ideas around quickly. If you're not able to do that, you become like the blockbuster in which, I remember years ago, I had a recruiter who called me, as Netflix was starting to grow, and they were thinking that they could actually do a mail order with disposable CDs instead of having the whole sort of early model of Netflix. So I think you really have to think about innovation as a mechanism to grow. And so I don't know if I answered your question, Dan, but I think problem solving skills and critical thinking skills are probably the most important. And then of course there's a variety of other technical skills which are much needed at this point.
So thank you, Chris. That was great. My question, which you answered, that having the design thinking, problem solving, critical thinking, those are really EQ skills rather than IQ skills. And so the the demarcation there, right, it goes against what we have traditional education for, though.
I agree. And I would actually say that we're not helping students develop the critical thinking skills that are needed. And the problems that we're trying to solve are complex, right? And so it's not just, oh, I know AI or I know this particular technology. I think that you really have to approach it from a problem solving approach, and that it's not an easy process. I mean, I'm fortunate now to be teaching this class at Columbia University with these graduate students who are amazing. We're working on a bunch of these different with a dozen or so companies trying to solve some interesting problems. But you start to realize that there's a level of complexity, and I don't think people are being trained towards critical thinking anymore. And so that's my biggest concern today. So thanks, Dan, for your question.
Thanks,
so
Chris.
I see another one by Mike Reed. It's great to see you. So how do we protect the world from bad actors and the worry of fake news? With tech, everyone in the world could go wild. In 1990, we thought we had the internet. We thought the internet might be a problem. Yes, I do think that we did. But we had those bulletin boards, and everybody was worried as to who had the liability on the bulletin boards. So it was a completely different problem. And then social media exploded, and that's where all the data that started feeding the AI allowed it to grow, because it was an unbelievable amount of data that was available for training these and helping develop these new systems. But I think that part of the problem, and you raise a really good point, Mike. I mean, obviously you're also in the cybersecurity space. I worked with you at OneMain as well, and cybersecurity is a big issue. I mean, it's become sort of a weapon by nation states. It's like there isn't there isn't a day that goes by where you don't hear about some massive hack or some attack on a healthcare system where people can't get healthcare or get their prescriptions filled. And so it's a huge problem. And I know there's a lot of people trying to work on solutions around how people certify themselves with respect to a Zoom call, because even Zoom calls have been used as a mechanism by which to have bad actors have actually faked their identity and been able to get organizations to transfer money. And so this is probably one of the biggest problems that we're dealing with. But I think one of the things, this kind of goes back to the issue of how do you authenticate yourself and how do you identify yourself, and finding better ways of doing that. I know in Europe you have a lot of mechanisms in which you get some sort of certification or tokenization of identity that you can use to, for example, make payments or work with government systems. But I think that being able to use your identity in the creation or have organizations authenticate things is going to become even more important. And from the cybersecurity risk, I think that that's one of those areas that is incredibly important. You look at our healthcare systems and the vulnerability of IoT devices. I'm on the board of a semiconductor company that creates, these microcontrollers and used in the healthcare space. And this is obviously really important. I mean, obviously we have cybersecurity is on the top of our list in terms of capabilities, but this is a huge problem because the complexity of our networks is increasing, and so it's not going to become easier anytime soon. But it does create opportunities for people in this space. So I don't know if I answered the question, but
yeah. Thank you, Chris. I was just thinking whether actually the cybersecurity, the bad actors, the fake news will actually slow up innovation, because the regulator will have to put controls in place to stop things falling apart. And we saw a bit of that in the internet in our early days when we were a lot younger, right? Well, you look the same age as when I saw you in 1990. I haven't put my video on so people can't see how old I look. But anyway, I just think we might find regulation slows up innovation, particularly in Europe.
No, I do. I did work in the open banking space, and I remember I would always say to myself that the Europeans are really good at coming up with open banking, utilizing data out of bank accounts in order to be able to figure out if that sort of rhythm of incoming invoices could actually pay for some sort of a loan as a mechanism by which to be able to provide capital for small organizations and for people as well. And there was a lot of regulations on how to use that PSD2 as a part of GDPR, right? But what's interesting is that in the United States, we didn't have those regulations, and you had companies over there innovating, SoFi and a ton of companies that came up with a lot of different ideas on how to use the technology. So I do think regulations are good, and I would say that Europe is always at the lead. They do the best job with regulations, but I think that the United States always does a good job of just sort of running full speed and crashing through that until it breaks. And then they're like, okay, let's figure out how to regulate it. So I am concerned, but I don't know how you would. I mean, obviously there's some laws that if you do certain things that now they'll be sort of looked at as criminal activities. But, looking at how often the cyber criminals get prosecuted, that number is usually not that high. So I really do think that it boils down to identity. And I know that, like in Spain, for example, you have these sort of digital tokenized identities that you use for a variety of different things. And so I think having these mechanisms in which you tie your identity to your activities through using sort of these cryptographic signatures, I think will become more important. But that's just my personal opinion on that. I don't know if
Thank you. No, you've answered it. Thank you very much. Excellent.
Thank you. So Rumi, how are you? So regulatory change, your question here, regulatory change should and will define corporate actions. I totally agree with you. And the EU AI Act is being rolled out. It's interesting. So I do think that, and so when you look at, I spoke in Europe at one of the healthcare conferences because I'm a co-founder of a healthcare company that uses AI. And we talked a lot about the use of data. So, for example, in the healthcare space, you should have access to your own data and what's going to happen to the secondary use, et cetera. So there's a lot of discussions around data in general. And with respect to AI, understanding what data is consumed into a model and, there's a lot of very practical aspects. And I'm actually involved in the New Jersey Bar Association in creating some of the regulations for New Jersey, or proposals for AI regulations. So I'm familiar with that space. I would actually say, though, that obviously there's risks, because, as I explained before, when the AI consumes the data, you can't just say, "Oh, erase that, forget you saw that." So if you've got something like PP, personally identifiable data, or you've got legal documents about personal, very personal information, and that starts getting added to these public AI systems, it does end up creating some issues. But I think that from an education perspective, I don't think everybody even understands the difference between these various ones. I don't think regulation is going to go away, but I actually do argue you have to put it in the context of innovation. And so I look at it, like, for example, Italy, they just sold their telecom lines to KKR, right? And my argument to some of the folks in Italy was that in order to successfully roll out AI, which would be necessary if you're going to keep all the data in Italy and you're going to analyze it in Italy, you need to have some innovation there. You need to have, the hyperscalers need access to telecom, electricity, and water for the cooling, right? And so you have to think about the infrastructure in the context of having the regulatory space to be able to innovate, because if you don't have the insights on the data, you're not going to be able to compete. And think about it, Italy is sort of leading the problem of healthcare, in that they don't have enough doctors. In 5 years, 50% less doctors, and aging population, right? So if they're not able to use AI to create some efficiencies, they're going to be in trouble. So I think regulation is good, but you have to do it in the context of, how do I allow how do I not prevent innovation in my country and in my organization? So thanks for your question, Rumi. Let me see, Paul Varadian. When will AI be able to understand irrational human behavior with predictive prescriptive solutions to stop fraud and cyber? So AI has been used for fraud for many years. I mean, obviously, those of us with American Express cards, I know that I love my fraud protection on American Express, because while it's annoying to get all these notifications about certain expenses, they do a pretty good job of figuring out my predictive behavior and knowing that I'm not in another part of the world buying something I never buy, right? So, but I think that what's important to understand about AI today, especially in the generative space, consuming a lot of information and then trying to sort of make sense of that information is one thing, but it's not critical thinking, right? And that's the argument that I was making when Dan asked the question about skill sets. You still need to have this critical thinking skill to be able to be sort of a problem solver and figure out how to use these Lego boxes of technology in the right places. I mean, I worked in blockchain very, very early on through my volunteer work at MIT. And I remember like everyone wanting to use blockchain for everything on the planet. And that's not the right approach. What you have to do is really think about, like, what is the problem I'm trying to solve, and what's the best, what are the characteristics of the problem, and what does the customer need, and then figure out, like, what types of technology I can use to actually, solve these problems. And so anyway, I think that generative AI is great, and it can absorb a lot of information and sort of predictively sort of make assumptions and guesses and summaries. But I think that there's a lot of other types of AI that have to evolve as well. And I think that in some ways, the way that carbon takes up all the oxygen in the room for ESG, I think that generative AI also is doing the same thing. And I hope that the different types of AI will evolve as well, and they won't be suffocated by the fact that generative AI is so fun and always has such interesting things to say. So so going down the chat here, thanks, Michael, for, so one of my companies did have some interesting news today, so thank you so much. Yes, there was an announcement on Grid. And then Subham, thank you so much. Says, thanks, Cristina, for for great insights. Thank you. My question is, how can businesses secure compliance with evolving cybersecurity regulations while implementing the next generation technologies? And that's a really, really good question, because I think that the regulatory bar is rising every day, especially when it comes to data. And of course, cyber is about the confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility of data. So of course, if you're not using the data properly, it's a breach and you have a cyber incident. And of course, you fall right into the cybersecurity regulations. And of course, from so it's not even just the data aspect, it's the artificial intelligence aspects as well. So I think that unfortunately, there are a lot of people that use OpenAI and they stick all kinds of documents in there, not recognizing that it swallows it up and mathematically locks that confidential information into its system, and you can't unlock it, right? So there's a lot of public general purpose AI being used for things that probably it shouldn't be used. There has to be an education there, but I don't think that with these closed systems, we're using a small LLM in your own environment, and you are using it internally with a certain level of controls. I think that to some degree, it isn't that difficult to stay within your regulatory world or requirements, but you also have to have visibility, and being on public boards, one of the first questions you ask, it's like, what kind of data do you have? What's the retention period? What are the liabilities associated with it? And a lot of board members don't ask those kind of questions because they don't understand that they're supposed to. And so I think it's really important that leaders understand, what are the benefits of embracing these technologies and sort of what are the risks. But the regulatory landscape is not going to get any easier, and it's really about having governance KPIs and really sort of managing the innovation and understanding what the technologies that you're using, what are the risks associated with that. So I hope I answered your question. John Edwards just asked a question here. So we'll be able to reflect on the slides you presented. I was intrigued by the long, slow evolution of artificial intelligence. So Kimberly, you will be sharing this video afterwards, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay,
I can send it
great,
out to
great.
everyone, and it will be on our social pages as well.
Wonderful. So you'll have access to that. And then appreciate AI as human-made rather than naturally occurring in biological sense. However, do you think the term artificial is misleading? It's time to think about changing the terminology. Well, it's funny. So, the history of the word was that, McCarthy in the early days, he was trying to get a grant from Rockefeller Foundation. And so he wanted a really sexy word in order to get that attention. And so I think it was like a $5,000 grant, which was some time ago, but and that's where the word came up. And so there's been a lot of talk about how it is somewhat misleading, because if you think about the trajectory of all these various types of artificial intelligence, from AI to expert systems, for example, these subcomponents of utilizing this technology are definitely not. Doesn't seem like artificial intelligence of superhuman capabilities, but they do provide very interesting capabilities. And so I do think that there are a lot of terms that are starting to evolve as new innovations like the transformer and generative AI start to evolve. And I think that it's hard to move away from AI, because it's such a it's like the word AI immediately gets
catchy,
people,
isn't it? Yeah,
it's catchy.
yeah.
And
It's
so
funny. It's funny you mentioned Rockefeller, because I thought about the term alternative medicine that was implemented many, many years ago, and it just feels like it's a bit of a smokescreen to what it actually is, because it's doing things that humans are doing and
yeah,
can do. So it's not artificial; it's very real.
totally agree. I totally agree. But I don't think of it as sort of like a threat that's going to take over the world. I think about it like, like the word processor, that when it came out, and because obviously, I think critical thinking is, to Dan's question in the beginning, is such an important skill that's not really being taught. And it's so important because these little sort of siloed ideas by themselves don't necessarily solve the world's biggest problems. But when you think about healthcare, thinking about how you solve some of these big problems that we have to face, it requires a certain skill set. Not that you have to know every aspect of how the technology works, but you have to be able to ask the right questions to figure out, are you solving the right problem? And what is it that you need to implement to solve that? And so I don't think there is enough thinking around that. And that's probably the most important skill set that we need today. And so if you need a system to be able to read license plates for security, right? So it's a form of artificial intelligence, but I wouldn't call it like, it's not like an end all be all. It's solving a very important but small problem that needs to be solved. So, I think unfortunately the word is very popular now, just like blockchain was and internet and all these other words. And so, I don't see it. I don't see it going away anytime soon. And in terms of your last question there, everybody always talks about how these systems are going to just run away and then you won't need humans and they'll just, be totally out of control. I don't know about you, but I can't even get my set-top box to work all the time. So I just, and I'm constantly rebooting my machines. And so the idea that, that everything, that somehow or other you're going to flip a switch and technology is going to work on their own and won't have to be maintained, it's just never going to happen. And at the end of the day, we just have more and more problems that we have to solve, because in creating, solving one problem, you create another problem. So while we got rid of the manure problem in the streets of Manhattan, you now need to have cars serviced and you have to figure out the fuel. So all this innovation creates new opportunities, but it also creates other problems. And so I don't see a world in which people don't have to do anything. And if you look back at the eras where we had the most economic prosperity, it was at times where people were participating in the economy. And I do think that there is room for a variety of skill sets that are required. It's not just, deep tech, understanding how to create a silicon chip or some of these other very detailed chips. And we do need those skill sets. I think that there is a shortage of that. Like I think about, somebody mentioned Grid, which is a company that I'm on the board of, which does Bitcoin mining. And I think about the electric grid. Bitcoin mining has done a lot around stranded energy and innovation around that. But most people don't understand how the energy grid works and what is needed in order to sort of improve the distribution, what the bottlenecks are. And that's a big problem. But there aren't really enough even electrical engineers. I mean, I was an electrical engineer, but there aren't that many engineers that are even focused on those disciplines. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity out there, and it's not like doom and gloom.
No, I agree with you completely. I think it's here to assist in a big way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. So I don't know if we have any other questions, Kimberly.
Oh, we just had another one pop up. Fantastic.
Mark, okay. Do you see a disconnect in firms in all industries trying to jump using AI to solve issues while neglecting to access their data quality? Most certainly. And if you think about, so I worked on an AWS opportunity when I was RSA, where they launched something called App Fabric around. We provided sort of a compliance solution on the back end of a system that enabled all these SaaS applications to be sort of turned on and off. And the compliance was for all of the AI generated and all the communications that were going between these various SaaS applications. And I think most people are using, or organizations are using something like 200 SaaS applications today. But the reason why I bring that up is because it isn't always intuitively obvious, the fact that is like a risk to have all this data moving all over the place, being pulled from one place, generated and sent to another location, right? So I would actually say that the average person on their desktop doesn't have either their email or their files that are properly tagged. And then when you're using these systems that are able to sort of peek into a variety of databases within organizations, I would actually say that the quality isn't necessarily what it needs to be. And I would also say that that they're not labeled to restrict access the way they should be. And then the other thing I was going to point out too, because obviously having been involved in the healthcare space, one of the big issues that comes up when people say, you should have access to your data is the fact that there are organizations that are worried that if you have access to your data, you might find out something that you should probably have known some time ago, or something that somebody didn't catch. And so there's a fear of a liability in not necessarily doing, what they should have done with the data that they'd had. So there are organizations that don't necessarily feel comfortable with sharing the data that they get from, that, the service providers provide or gather during sort of healthcare procedures. So I think that data access, quality management is a big issue. And I think that most organizations aren't even thinking about sort of the retention period and liabilities. So, anyway, hope that answers your question.
Ben, I think it's just a thank you, a huge thank you from me, and thank you to everyone who joined. If you do have more questions, I'm sure Cristina will be more than happy to answer them. I'm sure they can contact you on LinkedIn,
Yes,
Cristina.
that's perfect. Perfect. I appreciate
Yeah.
that. So thank you so much. I really appreciate that.